Hello, good evening everybody. My name is Peter Wainwright and welcome to this evening's webinar on Better Governance, Better Consequence. The webinar runs from now until 8 o'clock and you'll see that we can have a lot of interactivity through the chat, and I'll be explaining that a bit later. So some of you may have been at the webinar on the 23rd of February. Unfortunately, I wasn't there. So those of you who were, that'd be great. You can add to the richness of the discussion. But for those of you who weren't, this is what the webinar is designed to be, just to give you some snippets from that half-day session. And the aim is to try and broaden your knowledge on governance, rules, structure, and regulations, and that's going to help you. And perhaps get us to think of governance in a slightly broader way, in the way that we're used to. So I'll now introduce you to our panel, or effectively our speaker and myself. Professor Simon Lee is a professor of law and director of the Citizenship and Governance Strategic Research Area at the Open University. And you can see my details there. I'm an MBA alumnus, a consultant at Aspira, but I'm also an associate lecturer. So I'm now going to hand you over in a few seconds to Simon, and he'll be giving us an overview. But just briefly, look at this agenda. We've done our brief introduction. You can post questions by placing them in the chat, and as we go along, I'll be picking them up, and so will Simon. And we'll use some of those in the discussions after our two video segments and as we discuss the two polls. You can see the structure there. Simon's going to give us an overview of that day, just to set the scene. Then we're going to have a 5-minute video on skating on thin ice and current affairs. And Simon will explain that phraseology in a minute. Then we're going to have a poll and a discussion of about 10-12 minutes. Then we'll move on to our next video segment, which is looking at sports, governance in the Goldilocks Zone, the structure of success, with Etienne Stott as the speaker in that segment, which is about 11 minutes long. Then we're going to have a second poll and a discussion, and then we'll wrap up the key learning themes from the day. So I'd now like to hand over to Simon. So perhaps you could just give us a brief overview of that session on the 23rd of February.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, and welcome everybody. I'm Simon Lee. I've run businesses and universities, and now, as you've heard, I'm a law professor here at the Open University and Director of Citizenship and Governance Research. So I suggested that any week of the year there would be a business story and a sports story that would illustrate the challenges you're all facing in governance. And we should just take those as they came. And in that particular week, as in February, we took the issue of Rolls-Royce was reporting its profits, or in this case, its losses. And its losses were partly to do with the fluctuating pound after Brexit, but also to do with a huge fine it had received from the Serious Fraud Office investigation. It was agreed by Sir Brian Leveson, a judge you'll have heard of, that they would pay a fine of £670 million for bribery and corruption over a number of years in a dozen different countries. And that seemed to me extraordinary, growing up as I did in an era where people talked about Rolls-Royce models of this, that, and the other as the peak of excellence. So I wanted to touch on that. I wanted to link it to sport. And in the week of the seminar, we had Sutton United getting very excited about doing well in the FA Cup. But on the day, it was spoilt to some extent because their reserve goalkeeper was shown on TV on the bench eating a pasty, and clearly he'd been involved with a betting company who'd suggested that he should do that. There was a bet on. Some of his friends made some money out of it. The media had a bit of a laugh at first, and then the poor chap lost his job. So those are the issues we were looking at. But to put it in context, I showed a video, which you'll see a bit of in a minute, of a speed skating final in the Olympics. Perhaps afterwards I can explain why I did that. But you know what that's like. You either take risks, you go out front, or you perhaps risk staying off the pace. Perhaps you're going to crash. Perhaps you're going to be the last one left standing. Is that what it's like in business? That's the kind of thing we're thinking about. And so if we look at all that, well, I'll then come back and talk about how I was very surprised after Rolls-Royce crashed, so to speak, on bribery and corruption. When I looked at their website, to see their advice on governance, and in particular, their advice on ethics.
Okay, Simon, thanks very much. So, unfortunately, we're not joined by Pete Winkleman or Etienne, but so Simon will be answering our various questions, and we'll be seeing really what experiences you've got. So I think the power of our attendees and the audience is very rich, and in the past we've had some really great examples which we'll be able to pick up on. So I'm now going to ask our platform technical folks if we could launch the first video, please. So sit back and enjoy this 5-minute segment.
So my question really at the beginning is, as a goalkeeper, because I wanted to get away from the idea of governance is about the referee. I think it's really about the goalkeepers. You know, you've got everybody in front of you. They're trying to get past you. Can you see what's happening on the field? Can you anticipate where the risks are, where the opportunities are for your team? And I wonder if over the last year, whether you predicted that in football, Leicester would win the Premier League, that the Brexit referendum would go in favour of leaving, that President Trump would win, or that there'd be another goalkeeping issue this week. This is Piegate. Yeah? So this guy, people know the story. This is the Sutton United reserve goalkeeper in his 40s, and it was the biggest day in the club's life. It had been fantastic, hadn't it? All the attention they were getting. He was a hero in the media up until the weekend because he sleeps in the office, he sweeps it out, he is the community liaison officer and so on. And then Sun Bets decided to have a bet, an 8-to-1 novelty bet. Would somebody on the subs bench eat a pie? Big question as to whether it was a pie or a pasty, but you get the general idea. And he told a few mates, and it seemed to be a great laugh. I don't know if anybody's read a book by Brian Glanville, a novel called Goalkeepers Are Crazy, but it says goalkeepers are supposed to be crazy, aren't they? I mean, you have to be a little bit crazy to be a goalkeeper. But he got into trouble. So he was, if you like, skating on thin ice. And you've seen his size, and you wouldn't recommend skating on thin ice if you were Wayne Shaw. Now, could anybody have anticipated it, and what happened next? The club, widely been said, have left him hung out to dry, haven't they? He was persuaded to resign. The chairman and the manager accepted the resignation, and he looks like his dream job has come to an end. It's not just about performance, not just about coaching, but I think that there are some lessons here. One of the lessons for Wayne Shaw, Sutton, President Trump, your business, Brexit, anything that's happening, is the issue of when things go wrong, was it a question of luck? In my experience, when things have gone wrong for me, it's always been a question of bad luck. Yeah? But when I win, I rarely attribute it to good luck. I tend to think it was brilliant planning, foresight, governance, call it what you will. In terms of the business world that's going on around us, you see companies or universities running into difficulties, crashing, if you like, companies merging and so on. And sometimes it is the last one left standing who wins the prize. Sometimes, though, you go around at the back and you lose. They don't fall over. And also in some sports, the governance rules are that you've got to try harder. So in racing, it's a fine line. Foyne-Avon and some other times a horse wins after others have fallen at the jumps. But sometimes jockeys are fined for not riding out, for not trying to win. So actually what you do in a sport game or in a business game or in the public service, in a hospital, in a university, is complex. And I'm not saying that we should always just rely on other people to fall over. Mostly in governance speak, we talk about disasters like the people falling over. And I think that if we do that, if we talk about football's many mistakes, betting problems, FIFA, the FA, lack of diversity, and so on and so forth, if we talk about that, we would miss the positive side of sport, of business life, of our work in our different organizations. So I think that the point is simply that governance, running a business, how you regulate it, how you live out your values, how you make sure that you don't have a rogue trader, how you anticipate the risks or the banana skins is not very glamorous, but it's not just about process. It's about focus. It's about seeing what's happening in front of you, as a goalkeeper has the privilege of doing, but anticipating what's happening.
Okay, folks, so there's some very interesting questions arising there. Just a moment, getting a bit of feedback. So if we look at Simon, a question here that's arisen, and the one that I was going to ask is in relation to that segment, something about risk management. Is it just simply about identifying and dealing with risks? I suspect it's something broader than that. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think we've seen, even this week, for instance, that Sarah Hogg, proposed as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, she'd been through this tick box exercise of have you got any conflicts of interest. In fact, she'd written the rules, but she hadn't quite filled them in for herself, and in the end she felt compelled to resign. So very much is what we were saying on the day of the seminar, was that it's not just about can you identify risks and tick them off. It's about the mindset. How would you play what's in front of you when it's unanticipated, when people do something different? And
good point. Yeah.
In that video clip, but explains the skating on thin ice, was that Steve Bradbury won a gold medal at Salt Lake City in 2002 when all the other skaters fell in front of him. They crashed into one another on the last bend. And so people said he was lucky. But actually, I showed the people at the seminar that he'd done the same in the semi-final and he'd done the same in the quarterfinal.
Right.
And then we had a video of him explaining that he'd been injured and he knew he didn't have the leg speed to win an outright fight, but he calculated what might happen and he did his best and he felt that he won legitimately.
Right. So talking about focus and taking and being a bit more insightful beyond risks. Folks, you can now see on screen poll 1, and I'll ask Simon to introduce it because we've got a little link there, which is only a 2-minute video, but Simon's going to explain it, and it appears in your resources section. So if you want to click that and display it, and you can get a flavour of Rolls-Royce's approach. And Simon's going to tell us about the trust model. And while he's doing that, we've got poll questions here. And at some point, I'll be asking our Workcast technical folks to sort of launch a poll. And then we'll be asking you to vote. And then we'll see what the results are. So, Simon, tell us a bit about the Rolls-Royce trust model, please.
Yes. So you've got a link there, and you can play it either now or at some other time. You can either listen to it now, or you can play it quietly, and you'll see on screen some of the words coming up. But when you eventually listen to it, there's an issue of the tone as well. So this is a 2-minute explanation to all employees of Rolls-Royce as to what to do if you have an ethical dilemma. And it takes T-R-U-S-T for trust. It says T is you must think. You must think about the dilemma. R is read. You must read the Rolls-Royce Code of Guidance. U is understand. You must understand what the issue is, and if necessary, that will involve other people. You must speak for S, and you must take action. And along the way, you can refer to human resources or other colleagues within Rolls-Royce. And so it was as if it's simple, just do it. If it's complex, remember trust model. But all the time, we know, over dozens of countries, over 20 years, the most senior people were collaborating with middlemen who effectively bribed companies to take Rolls-Royce engines to the tune of this £670 million fine. So what would you do if you had that 2-minute video to everybody, this trust model? Well, for a start, you might have taken it down, although it's still up there today on the website. This settlement came in January. And it came in January, by the way, because they just wanted to beat the inauguration of President Trump, because there were uncertainties as to what American prosecutors would do after that. So they made this agreement, and they just left it up there. Would you take it down? Would you improve it? Would you change the tone? Would you refer to what has gone on? Or would you just carry on as before?
Okay, so thank you very much. So I'll ask Bill from Bill is our technical man. Bill, if you could just put up the voting poll, and we'll ask our audience really to select one of those 4 options, A, B, C, or D. And while we're doing that, Simon, a quick question came in about culture on the chat. Which is what does this say about the culture in Rolls-Royce? This sort of
good question.
Gap between
and I tried to reply. I think that they're in a competitive market with other people trying to supply these engines to commercial airlines and to the defense ministries of different countries. And so, although we think, certainly I think, that they should have done the right thing and they should have played according to the rules of the game, the people actually involved obviously felt under huge competitive pressure to get the deal. They wanted to sell their engines. And so if it took a certain amount of persuasion, a few £1 million here, a Rolls-Royce car there, or even undermining the opposition, then they were prepared to authorize it or to collude with it, or at least not to stop it happening. And they felt that maybe it was like the discount you get in a local car dealer or something like that. It's just the way you have to do things. Whereas those of us who have the luxury of just sitting back would say, well, I don't think you should ever adopt bribery or corruption, and actually now it's illegal in this country to do so.
Okay, that's thank you. It shows what a complex issue it is. Now I can see the results have come through, and I just and hopefully you can all see it too. So you have 7.4% for remove it without replacement. 7.4%, I think, keep it without amendment. 55.6% about updating the text, and 29% about updating the tone and the content to make it less complacent. So is that what you would be expecting, Simon? Just simply updating the text? Quite a small number of people removing it, and I'd personally be tempted to perhaps remove it and think more broadly. But what do you think of those results, please?
It is interesting. I suppose that it's going to be interesting to see whether you change your view as you look at and listen to the video. In my experience in universities, if something horrible goes wrong, then the first thing you do is to look at the public perception of it, to remove something from a website, or to make sure the media don't get hold of a graduation photo of somebody or something like the UCAS form of somebody if they're involved in some terrible incident. And you try and protect the individuals involved and the organization. So I certainly wouldn't just personally leave it up without attending to it. I'd like to think that I would acknowledge it and own up, as I see some people saying on the chat. But whether you do can be complex, because who actually makes that call? Is it the chair of the board? Is it the chief executive? Are some of these people being eased out of the company?
Interesting, especially for such a large company where you have different levels of of decision making. So, okay, folks. So I think what we're going to do is move on now, and I'll ask Bill to now launch the second video, which is 11 minutes long, where Etienne Stott is talking about governance and issues in the sporting arena.
So, as a child, when I was watching the Olympics on TV, I remember just being in awe of the athletes when they managed to get on the top step of the podium and have the national anthem playing. And I just remember thinking, that's just amazing to see that they've triumphed over the whole world. And that became my ambition, actually. And I joined a local canoe club after learning to canoe in the Scouts. This is around when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And more than 20 years later, after a lot of ups and downs and more twists and turns than is strictly efficient, I managed to achieve that ambition with my crewmate Tim Bailey in London 2012. But the difference is nowadays I actually appreciate that triumph when you see an athlete on the top step of the podium in the Olympics. It's a triumph of that individual, but it's also a triumph of the team behind that individual. And it's also a triumph of the structure behind the team and behind that individual. And that's really the focus for my presentation today. It's going to be about what I've observed about how the governance of my sport created the structure for success. So really, canoe slalom is about precision and speed, because the winner is the person who negotiates the course in the fastest time and with the minimum amount of time penalties added on to their race. But I do know that Olympic sport is big business. Now, UK sport is funded through the National Lottery to the tune of £345 million per year that is given to Olympic sports in this country. And my programme, the Canoeing and Kayaking programme, takes £23 million across 4 years. And that's a significant investment. And for that investment, a return is demanded. And the return is Olympic medals and medals at the Olympic Games. And if a programme hits its target, then funding is maintained and that programme will survive. If the sport doesn't hit its medal target, then their funding will be reduced or taken away, and that sport will start to struggle and wither. But it's the athlete's job, therefore, to go out and win the medals. But nowadays in Olympic sport, it's so competitive, you cannot compete at a world level without a programme of support behind you. And the athletes need that programme, need a structure to be able to compete. But also the structure needs the athletes to go out and win those medals in order to be able to survive. So it's a sort of symbiosis, and then therefore the governance of the sport really sets up and regulates the symbiosis. So as I see it, the governance of my sport has had to make choices in how to nurture the talent and the abilities of the athletes in it to be able to get them to a level high enough where they can go out and win the medals. The governance of my sport has also had to make choice about how they select the athletes, because it's really important that you get the right people to go out there and secure those performances to be able to secure the future of the sport. So next I'll come to the governance choices in the selection process. And really the aim of a selection process is to make choices to get the right people to represent the programme, to represent the country, to deliver at the Olympic Games. And a normal way this is done is that specific races are identified, and then the performance of the athletes in those races are judged against their peers, and that's how you decide. It's a very intense, very difficult process, very stressful, but actually in my experience a very stringent selection means that once you've gone through that selection process, you actually have a bit more confidence that you're actually equipped and able to deal with the next challenge that you're going to face, which is the Olympic Games. So a stringent process, I think, is very, very important. In fact, in my experience, getting selected for the Olympics is actually as hard in many ways as actually racing at the Olympics. So the first continuum here I'm talking about is the transparency of the process, and this really is about how clear the governance of the sport makes the criteria against which the athletes are going to be selected. And really, again, we know that transparency is a lot of trouble. Scrutiny, we're finding out in Donald Trump bless his soul, or however you might say it, is finding out that high levels of scrutiny are very, very difficult, and people looking at what you're doing very carefully, asking questions and challenging, is very hard, and the governance of our sport really works very hard to do that. But I actually think that creating a transparent process is absolutely vital. For me, it meant that when I was very clear, when I knew exactly what I was getting into, when I knew what I was supposed to do and where the bar would be set, it meant very, very clearly that I was able to invest everything into that and to be able to commit fully to the process. At the other end, where you have a kind of opaque process, countries that do this, it's you can see the athletes don't trust the governance at all. And actually what's happening when they're going through their training and when they're going through these selection processes, they've actually got half an eye not on what they're actually doing, but half an eye on the governance to see when they're going to get done over and when they're going to get when they're going to be treated unfairly. They've always got an eye on a kind of escape route and the emergency exit handle, I suppose. And that is definitely not good for high performance. The next one here is notification, and this really relates to how far in advance the selection process is made clear to the athletes. Now, in Great Britain, we're kind of somewhere in the middle of this continuum here. We're notified normally 2 years before the Olympics, 2 years before the selection process occurs, right in the middle, because the Olympic cycle is 4 years. And really, the 2 years gives you time to evolve and time to figure out what you're going to need to do and how to best face that challenge. It gives you time to arrange your lifestyle. Perhaps you have to move your training venue and organize the way that you're going to work and set your training system up. And it's really very important. For me, you see some countries are notifying them at very short notice. And that's quite an interesting situation because with short notice, the governance of the sport can tweak the selection process in favour of athletes that they think will be able to respond to the Olympic Games in the best way. And once, because as you get closer to the Games, you start to know what the course is going to be like and what sort of challenges you're going to face. So if you notify very late, you can change the process just in the right way to hope that certain athletes will come through that process. Obviously, that creates grave difficulties for the other athletes, and there's very easy then for the governance of the sport to be accused of favouritism, and again that erodes trust, and then the athletes will not be focusing entirely on their process and what they're supposed to be doing. They'll have an eye on what's going on, waiting to be done in by the managers, in inverted commas. This next continuum is the duration of the process, and this really relates to how many races are identified in this as part of the selection process, or put in other words, how long the athletes are going to be under the scrutiny of the selectors. At the very extreme end here, you can have a one-off race, and that is actually very similar to what the Olympics is. You have in the Olympics, the race is just one race. You have to produce the result there. And if you can select someone who is able to deal with that, then you'll perhaps have a better chance of them actually delivering it in the Olympic Games. And if you can find someone who can deliver the run on that particular day, it's a really great advantage. You can withstand that pressure and withstand that scrutiny. The disadvantage of having a very short process of only having one race is that sometimes fluke results can occur. Finally, the timing of the selection process is absolutely crucial, how close you have the selection process to the Olympic Games. Now, if you have it really close, really with the Olympics very close by after this selection process occurs, you really keep the pot boiling for as long as possible. You keep the pressure on, you keep that creative drive moving, you give a maximum amount of time for this training effects to occur. And that, I think, is very interesting. But the problem is these selection processes are very, very tough physically, they're very tough emotionally, and they take a long time to recover from, and they take a while to kind of get over. And actually, if you position your selection process too close to the Olympic Games in terms of time, then in fact you very often get the athletes will not recover in time. And very often you will see athletes who perform well at the selection process don't actually bring themselves back up to speed in time for the Games because they just haven't had a chance to recover from that point of view. If you have the selection happens a long way in advance, a long time in advance of the Games, you have an interesting advantage there that once you've selected the team, you can actually divert the resources into that team and let the rest of the team do their own thing a little bit more. So, for example, they can have more training camps or more coaching and generally just different, higher level of support. I actually think that is an interesting thing to do. But the problem is, very often, I think it's human nature. When you go through a big process or a very tough challenge, after that point, it's easy to relax and have a little bit of a breather, and the foot comes off the gas a little bit. And if you select the team too far out, I actually think that is a possibility. So to select the best people, I believe it's important to have a transparent process, and it's well notified, and that actually gives the athletes time to prepare, and it also gives them the confidence to be able to invest in the process. I also think if you have the selection at the right time, and it's the right length of time, you give people the chance for the training effects to occur and make sure that their creativity is maximised, but also that they're able to recover in time.
Well, that was a very interesting talk from the sporting arena, and a lot of discussion there about choices, and we're going to come on to choice again with our poll too. So a quick question for you, Simon. Okay, I'm being told we may have just lost him. So what we'll do now is I'll ask Bill to put up the poll choice voting in a second. And I'll just run through this poll. It's very relevant, isn't it? Who doesn't know about the Oscars fiasco? And a very interesting question about governance. So the real question here is, what lesson would you take, that you personally would take in your organisational context, from the Oscars mixed up with the envelopes about the winners? So simply A or B. A, you really shouldn't outsource the governance of an important decision to an accountancy or consultancy firm, perhaps no matter how global and how impressive their track record. Or B, just don't blame the consultants or accountants. Just blame the people on scene at the time. Blame the actors who should have realised they'd been given the wrong envelope and sought clarification before announcing the winner. I like the point that Richard has made here. I belong to the CMI, IC, and IHM. All three have codes of practice, but in his experience, none of them are governed correctly. So that's quite interesting. So again, an opportunity to actually challenge those codes of practice. Do they, they may be comprehensive, but do they have elements that just don't cover the type of situations we've been discussing? The outsourcing has gone on for decades, says Mansour. Our accountants are not to be blamed. So I wonder what actually happened in that kind of process. Perhaps people just got complacent, perhaps. Right, the poll results are back. Very close. So 51.5% for A, don't outsource the governance, and 48.5% is, well, don't blame the accountants, blame the actors. So very, very evenly split. Simon Lee is just dialing back in, and I'll ask him to comment on that. But I think these issues come up in our lives all the time about, who to blame if things go wrong. And David has said he wants to blame both. The accountants had a useless procedure, and the actors are rubbish at double-checking. So Simon, glad to have you back. You can see our poll results very, very evenly matched. So, what's the answer?
Sorry about that. Sorry about that we went offline. But what we wanted to do, I'll come back to Etienne in a minute, if I may. But what we wanted to do with this second poll is to take something that we couldn't have addressed in the seminar itself because it hadn't happened. But to make this point, that there'll always be something in the news which you can use in your business as an example of how to run things. And in this case, as you know, PricewaterhouseCoopers were making quite a fuss beforehand that for 83 years they've been running this. And then on the night, I think perhaps the partner was a little bit starstruck, caught up with tweeting, whatever, and handed over the wrong envelope. Now, in other words, is it enough to say we're outsourcing this, we've got auditors, accountants, and so on and so forth? Or would you say, which brings back to the goalie rather than the referee point I was making at the beginning of the seminar, would you say, well, you've got to educate everybody in your business, your culture, your organization, so that, okay, maybe somebody does do something stupid like that, but you can take responsibility. So should the actors on the stage have done something else? Or is that unreasonable? It's quite evenly balanced as far as I can see from the early poll results.
And there's a couple of questions here you might want to pick up on. One is about, establishing the root cause is one, and also about having a blame culture is often the reason that people don't raise their hands. So it may be that somebody on a blame culture thought this risk might occur, but there wasn't a culture that allowed people to raise concerns. So I guess that's probably common in many organizations, that kind of blame culture. But it sounds a bit too much like a cliche. I don't know whether... So what do you think, Simon?
Well, we know that it was put to the Pricewaterhouse partners that something could go wrong by the media in the week before. And they said, basically that they didn't think it would, but if it did, then they would take action. They would go on stage. They would sort it out. On the night, they froze, and they didn't want to go out front. And so, again, you might have in an organization a culture which isn't complacent, and people say, I do know that if something goes wrong, then this is plan B. But on the occasion, you don't implement that. So then what do you do?
Very, very tricky. Maybe you get the accountants to announce the prizes. That would have been interesting, wouldn't it?
Well, the interesting thing in a way is they had a fail-safe, they thought, by having a second envelope, but it was that which caused the confusion. So they were trying to guard against the risk, but ultimately there's going to be this human error. So I guess what you would do with the benefit of hindsight is you would say, we have this in graduations all the time. So you've got hundreds of people graduating, and the dean and the vice chancellor wouldn't necessarily know everybody. So you say, here's your name on a card, you're going to hand it out in order, but if anything goes wrong, then please walk across the stage and we'll try and resolve it later on. But actually, if somebody fluffs their lines, or if the microphone goes off, as it did for me then, sorry about that, yes. Then actually sometimes people just don't do the sensible thing. Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway, whoever it might be, however used they are to being on stage, they may get a kind of stage fright. And so who comes in and sorts it out? Now, if you look at the overall issue, why is it an accountancy firm or a consultancy firm anyway, rather than, say, the Electoral Reform Society? What is it that we're managing here? And if it's a production, why so much emphasis on only two people know the result? Because actually you could run it in a different way, couldn't you? So you could go back to designing the operation rather than ticking the box of we've got externals in, we've got it governed properly.
Yeah. So Mark there has made a post there, like on the MBA, lots of why, what if, etc. So I guess, when you look at this, and we'll perhaps come to Etienne in a second, is it perhaps developing that culture of being able to ask why and to constantly question, and again with Rolls-Royce, do you think that's a solution, that not so much a blame culture, but making it okay for people to constantly question the way we do things?
Yes. So in my book Uneasy Ethics, which was written in 2003, in the business ethics chapter, I talk about the rogue trader issue, that at the very time Allfirst got into a problem, on the same day, the people who were listing the biggest 30 risks for banks had the rogue trader drop out of it, whereas after the Barings crisis, it had been a number one. So after a few years, or hereafter many years, you do get that complacency factor. But Etienne, to go back to that, Etienne was saying, and I'm sorry that my microphone went. Etienne was saying that there is a Goldilocks zone in everything, by which he means, not too early, not too late, not too hot, not too cold. You have to get these things right on a spectrum of whatever it is, openness or quality of decision making. And he was giving the example that in selection for the Olympics, if you go early on the selection, you have a trial a year in advance, that helps the winners prepare for their country. But on the other hand, everybody else thinks that's unfair. We haven't had a chance to prove ourselves. So if you wait till the week before, then they're exhausted because they built up to the trial rather than the actual race. So I think here, the whole issue of how you run the Oscars and the voting, you have the nominees and so on and so forth. It may be that the last minute is too late to organize the actual results, but they've played on this idea of secrecy and not knowing, and then they get caught out.
That's very, very interesting. Perhaps that there's lots of questions coming out about not blaming the actors and various outsourcing types of stories there, and HR enforcing things, etc. But can I posed a question? I think your mic went off, which is, what do you think of this idea that Etienne was talking about with having, let's say, these four kind of simple dimensions? It seems to be a sort of a way of simplifying some key governance aspects in a way that people can understand and prompts debate. So I wonder if that has some merit, that something we can learn from.
Yes. Now, if you take Etienne's model and then apply it to something else, like you're suddenly in the later rounds of the FA Cup as a non-league team, what do you think of? Do you try and cover everything? Do you say to the reserve goalie, whatever you do, don't eat a pasty or a pie? Well, obviously you don't go to that level of detail. But the same thing happened with the goalkeeper on the subs bench as happened with the accountants. And I think Alison has picked up on this with the accountants. That what happened was people became celebrities in their own right, and their head got turned a little bit. So the goalkeeper was constantly on the news in the run-up to it, and therefore the bookmakers played on him, and he wanted to play to the cameras, and he got his minute of fame, but then he got into trouble and lost his job. I feel very sorry for him. With the accountants, they were a little bit too full of themselves, I think is a way of putting it. And what Etienne is saying is, always think of the Goldilocks zone, not too much of this, not too much of that. How do you position yourself? And you can apply it to his own discipline of canoe slalom, where obviously you've got to get down a rapid course, but you've also got to get between the gates. And if you touch them, you're in real trouble. So it's a technical sport as well as a sport of requiring great speed and skill and strength in the water. So if you come right back to the speed skating as well, you've got to make a judgment call all the time. And the whole theme of this seminar and now the webinar is that you don't abdicate to a set of boxes or just a set of processes. You have to understand what you're doing, your whole culture, your whole sport, your whole business. And you have to be wary of the pitfalls. You have to understand, Rolls-Royce, that it is a tough market out there and people will be thinking about bribes and corruption. So I think that we're trying to raise issues. And I understand people saying, well, there's lots of whys, but where are the answers? But the answers lie within us.
That's absolutely true. I mean, on the bribery, for example, many organisations have anti-bribery policies, and staff are required to sort of sign them. And what you're saying and what's been coming out from the theme so far is that actually that needs to be questioned, because if you have a policy that's so hard and fast, how do people then interpret what is or isn't something like bribery? I mean, it may seem obvious to some people. So I like this idea of the Goldilocks zone. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things before we sort of get towards our final kind of wrap-up session. A couple of things on the chat. Elizabeth has said, good governance needs imagination and flexibility. Are robust systems too rigid? What do you think of that? Is it the role of imagination? What do you think of that, Simon?
Absolutely. all of my writing about law and business and ethics would emphasize that. And one of the examples I gave when I was teaching in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, we got students to write their own mini sequel to Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, to think about what would happen next. Partly because judges are always writing a new chapter in a book that somebody else began. And about 25 years later, it turned out that Harper Lee had herself written a sequel. So I hope students would remember that we asked an active imagination. And that's what we're really doing today as well, as we're saying, well, you've seen Rolls-Royce get into difficulties, you've seen PricewaterhouseCoopers get into difficulties. You've seen some sports people do well, and you've seen them struggle. So use your imagination to say, how would I approach the Olympics, our big day at the Cup final, our big day at the Oscars? And obviously, you're also trying to take everybody with you. So it's not easy in a business such as Rolls-Royce. I should say, by the way, that because they cooperated with the authorities in the end, the new management, and because of their importance to the economy, to all the people they employed, there were heavy discounts. The fine would have been at least twice as much if it weren't for the fact that ultimately they did begin to get a grip on what was happening, and they did cooperate with the authorities. And this brings us back to those who were asking about football fouls and so on. Rolls-Royce, in the end, did put their hands up. They did collaborate.
So when we talk about using imagination, there's a question here about sort of continuity planning, because a lot of organisations think have business continuity planning. What if? But I think sometimes that can perhaps get a bit too technical. So what role do you think that has, or is it perhaps going to not bring out the kind of imagination aspect that we were just talking about?
Yes, well, I think that you could say that the plan for PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Oscars was, if something happened on one side of the stage, the partner on the other side had the envelope, and so on. And the same thing happens at graduations and when my phone line goes down, whatever it might be. But really, the issue is more how do you use your own imagination, but your own moral compass, when you haven't anticipated what the issue might be. So clearly, Sutton United did not think that the bookmakers would talk to their reserve goalkeeper and say, he's a big guy, would you eat a pie for us, and we'll have a bet, and we'll get a lot of publicity. That was what it was about. They didn't think that through. So what did the poor chap do? He fell for it, didn't he? But how do you inculcate a sense of doing what is right? Now, the trust model sounds sensible, but it clearly didn't work. So do you improve it a little bit to come back to the first poll? Would it have been better if it had just been a different mnemonic, or said in a less complacent voice, or done in a different way? Or will there always be these issues? And so when we were setting up this whole event, we didn't want to have a tick box mentality, although obviously you would like to have a continuity plan, you would like to have a point of reference.
So that's and then there's another, before we sort of ask you to do a sort of final wrap up, there's a question here, a point here from David about, some people only need 10 principles, etc. Others need lots and lots of pages. Some wanted just on one page. So, but there is a tendency in many organisations to have lots of pages and then perhaps ask managers to make decisions. But maybe sometimes we actually need to reduce the number of the amount of written guidance, and as you say, focus more on our own individual kind of thinking and creativity, perhaps. So do you think we need to actually reduce all our kind of guidance? Would that make life simpler for us, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I think that Rolls-Royce had a wonderful name, didn't they? Just stood for quality. And so if you think about that, the way I would begin, as I think the poll indicated, the way I would begin a revised trust model video, if you're going to refer to the problem, would be to say, we at Rolls-Royce make the best engines in the world, or we like to think we make the best engines in the world. of course, we sometimes make mistakes. But the reason why we make the best engines in the world is we always learn from our mistakes. Now, we've made some mistakes in the way we've handled our business, and we apologize for that. We've paid our dues. Different people are now running the business, and we've learned from it, and this is what we've learned, and then go on like that. But clearly some people in the poll don't agree with that and think that maybe that's too confessional, maybe you shouldn't own up in that way, and maybe just come up with a different way of looking at things. But I don't think a 100-page document would have stopped the bribery and corruption. I think that what you need is to live it out every day as to, we're going to do it right. That's what they say, but that's not what they did.
That's very. Thanks, Simon. That's very, very, very clear sort of response to that question. And one final one: doesn't too much flexibility lead to inconsistency? How do we manage that? So, especially in a multi-led, multi-business organisation, allowing people to think more for themselves under some, a headline principle, or what, your strap line. But how do you get consistency?
Yes, and that's been a challenge for us in universities, hasn't it, Peter, that in the olden days, exam boards used to have a lot of discretion. But students, quite rightly, want to know where they stand. And yes. examiners sometimes gave everybody 59% or something, and then they got told, well, either make it 62 or 58, but be clear, be decisive, and so on and so forth. And then I used to be in a law faculty where we had law, but you could also do law with French, or you could do law with accounting. Now, this brings us back to PricewaterhouseCoopers. If you did law with accounting, in the accounting, some people got 100% and some people got 0. But in law and French, everybody seemed to get 59%. So how could you be consistent and fair across different subjects? So universities, we certainly have our problems of governance and that balance. And this is where Etienne's model, I think, is very helpful, that you want to be fair to the individual, but you want to be fair to the whole collective. And so you've got a spectrum. You've got to find the Goldilocks zone that's the right place.
Okay, talking of Goldilocks zone, I think we're approaching that now. So before I just sort of do my wrap-up bit, any final thoughts or summarizing thoughts, standing back, looking at the whole kind of topic? Any kind of one or two key points you think has come out from our discussions this evening?
Well, I think people are making lots of good points. Several people, most recently I can see Penny, talking about the fact that when a rogue trader made a profit, nobody seemed to own up. We obviously don't know exactly who made profits out of those kinds of things, but I think that's an important issue, isn't it? Is that sometimes the business benefits from people taking a risk that they shouldn't have done, or perhaps acting unethically or illegally. So we've got to balance all of this, and we've got to think about what we're trying to do in our working lives. And if you come back to Steve Bradbury and the skating on thin ice idea, that what seems to be luck in one case can, the more you find out about it, turn out to be a very realistic assessment of the competition and how to do the best that you can. So looking back at it all, I would say that people are asking the right questions. There are a lot of whys in there, and you might have expected that we would tell you how to read the rules, how to get the regulation or the governance right. But I think that there is no generic answer which will solve all the problems for people. What they've got to do is to engage, as we're trying to do tonight, in dialogue. You've got to talk it through, and you've got to try to use imagination, as you said, and as other people have said. You've got to try and imagine what would happen if. And that's why I think business schools do a good job when they have hypotheticals, they have case studies. I remember very much when I was a young lecturer in law, my boss, now Sir Ian Kennedy, used to give the example all the time of what if there were Siamese twins and you had an operation to separate them and the parents weren't sure what to do. One would die, one might live. And some students say, well, that's ridiculous. that'll never happen. But then it did happen, and it became a famous case. And so the kinds of things that we're talking through may then happen, or something similar may happen. And the idea of the webinar is to encourage you to think through the principles of better governance so that you have a better consequence in your own life.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for giving us some fantastic insights and sharing with us so lucidly your thinking. It's a challenging thing to do online. And thank you to our attendees for some very rich discussions. We've not been able to reply to them all, and as somebody said, an hour has gone quickly. So just before we log off, it's just remains for me to tell you that the next Business Perspectives event, which has now been running for, I think, about nearly 3 years now, a very successful series, will be announced in the summer, and hopefully we'll have the similar sort of format of a face-to-face and then a webinar on a subject that seems to work quite well. But keep an eye out on the website there. I think you will also be sent an email to ask you for your experience. But again, look at the blog there and do get in touch. Keep the various LinkedIn groups and pages. And I think tonight we had about maximum 69 people online, which is quite an achievement, bearing in mind all the other competing pressures in our lives. So that really leaves me to say thank you to everybody. Do have a look at those pages. You can see all the vast range of services that the Open University Business School Alumni and Careers Network can offer. And you're part of a very, very large network. So make the most of it. And hopefully we'll see some of you again at a future event. But meanwhile, once again, thank you to Simon, and thank you for Bill and others at Workcast and my colleagues in the Open University External Engagement Office, particularly Christina Barrett, who's been the main manager of coordinating this. So good night, everybody, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Simon.